Good morning, honorable adjudicators. My name is Roland Nathaniel Tidayo, and my school is SMAN 2 Palangka. Today, I will act out as the first speaker of the government team. In other words, my team proudly stands in support of the motion. This House believes that economic sanctions do more harm than good. The other two speakers are Ashraf and Azahra. Before I present our case, let me define the motion clearly. Economic sanctions are deliberate restrictions imposed by one country or a coalition of countries on another country's economy. Trade bans, financial restrictions, asset freezes, or investment limitations. They are usually framed as a peaceful alternative to war, meant to pressure a government into changing its behavior without firing a single bullet. But the question today is not whether sanctions sound peaceful. The question is whether, on balance, their consequences outweigh their intentions. My team believes they do not. The first one is sanctions punish the people with the least power, not the people making the decisions. Political elites rarely feel sanctions the way ordinary citizens do. They retain access to state resources, private wealth abroad, and networks that let them route around restrictions. It is the factory worker, the farmer, and the patient who absorb the costs. We don't have to look far for this. When sanctions and war disrupted Russian and Ukrainian grain and fertilizer exports in 2022, the shock didn't stay contained to Europe. It reached Indonesian farmers who suddenly faced sharply higher fertilizers prices and Indonesian consumers who felt it through cooking oil and wheat-based staples like flour and instant noodles. None of these people had any say in the decisions that triggered the sanction regime in the first place. They simply absorbed the cost of conflict fought thousands of kilometers away. This is the core problems. Sanctions are aimed at governments, but governments are rarely the ones who pay. Iran is a useful, if contested, example here. Decades of sanctions have undeniably strained Iran's economy, but they have not produced regime change or a fundamental reversal of the policies they targeted. Iran adapted, found alternative buyers, and its government has, if anything, used sanctions rhetoric to consolidate legitimacy at home. We raise this carefully because reasonable people disagree about how much Iran's calculus has shifted. But even sanctions defenders concede the core political objective remains largely unmet after all this time. Russia tells a similar story. Sweeping sanctions since 2022 have hurt Russia's economy. That much is measurable. But Moscow found new markets, including in Asia, and continued the very policy sanctions were meant to stop. This is also where Indonesia's own positions become relevant. Indonesia, holding to its free and active foreign policy, has resisted joining Western sanctions regimes and has had to carefully navigate whether to purchase discounted Russian energy without triggering secondary sanction risks to its own banks and companies. This is not a hypothetical for us. This is a live policy dilemma on our own governments has had to manage. Precisely because sanctions regimes create costs and complications that ripple far beyond their intended target. When a tool causes broad economic damage, entrenches nationalist narratives at home, and still doesn't reliably deliver the political outcome it promised, we have to ask what exactly it accomplished.
Good morning, honorable educators, respected opponents, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Azahra Miftah Rizky Atailah from SMA Negeri 2 Palangkaraya. I am here as the second speaker of the proposition team. I am here to reinforce my team case and explain why economic sanctions do more harm than good. I would like to begin with the opposition team that may argue that economic sanction is a peaceful alternative compared to war. Our team do agree that war should be avoided at all costs, but does that really mean economic sanction is the best and effective and also humane option? Why? Because economic sanction it come at a cost of many innocent civilians who lose access to basic necessities like food, medicine, and even economic opportunities. The opposition team may also claim that sanction pressured the governments into changing their behavior. And ladies and gentlemen, with all due respect, our team disagree with this claim. My first speaker has already shown that economic sanctions it punishes the wrong people, and they most often fail to change the government behavior. From Iran to Russia, we have seen that the governments they adapt while the ordinary citizens they continue to bear the economic burden. This shows that the real cost of sanction it is not paid by the people who are in power. They are paid by the people who are least responsible with the conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, economic sanction also creates global economic instability that affect countries far beyond the original conflict. In today's world, where economies are closely linked, when major economies face sanction, global supply chains are disrupted. Prices of basic essential goods like oils or groceries increase across many countries. And this is not just a problem for the sanctioned country. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to also mention that Indonesia has also felt the effects of economic sanctions. Like during the Russia Ukraine conflict, food and fertilizers rise in prices. They became more expensive. And so, farmers, businesses, and families, they had to pay the higher prices even though they were not involved in the conflict. This statement proves that economic sanctions they don't only hurt the countries being targeted, but they also affect the innocent people in other countries who are not involved. Ladies and gentlemen, our team believes that there are much more better and effective options or alternatives, including diplomacy, targeted international courts, and also peaceful negotiations. These methods that I have said, they hold the leaders accountable without putting the greatest burden on the innocent citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, economic sanctions they do more harm than good because they punish the innocent civilians and they were also shown to frequently fail to change the government behavior. And also they create economic consequences that extend beyond far the countries they are intended to affect. And so, ladies and gentlemen, for these reasons, our team firmly supports today's motions that economic sanctions do more harm than good. Thank you so much for listening.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, honorable adjudicators. My name is Muhammad Syabal Zahri, and I'm from SMA N2 Palangka. Now, I'm standing here as the third speaker of the government team. My role here is to strengthen and reinforce my team's argument and explain why economic sanctions do more harm rather than they do good. Now, my teammates have already shown two important points. The first one being economic sanctions hurt innocent people way more than the government that they're trying to pressure. Prices of food, fuel, and medicine become more and more higher than normal. And that makes people lose their jobs and make families struggle to meet their own daily necessities. Second, sanctions often fail to meet their own main goal. Instead of changing their actions, governments find new trading partners and other ways so that they can still continue. So at the end, the leaders stay in power while the innocent civilians continue to suffer. Now, the opposition team may argue that sanctions are much better than going to war. While yes, we agree that war should always be avoided, but that does not automatically mean that sanctions are a good solution either. people can still suffer without bombs, weapons, and violence. The damage is real when parents can't afford to buy food, when hospitals run out of medicine, and when people lose their jobs. It may not be a battlefield, but it's still a humanitarian problem. The opposition team may also argue that sanctions can force governments to change. But as my first speaker had already explained, countries like Iran and Russia find new trading partners and continue their own policies instead of changing. And that shows that sanctions do not always bring the change that they promise to. Another important point is that sanctions can affect other countries. If trade is disrupted, then prices of food, fuel, medicine, and fertilizer around the world will also be impacted. And as my first speaker had mentioned, even Indonesia felt the impact of it too. And so that shows that sanctions can affect more than one country's border. Ladies and gentlemen, uh, we can't judge a policy based on what their purpose is, but by what the result is. If a policy causes suffering, increases poverty, and do not meet the main goal, then we should ask whether or not is it really a good solution. Even if sanctions pressure the government to change, but the innocent civilians are the ones who got hurt the most. Even if sanctions are a better alternative to war, but it still creates humanitarian problems. And even if sanctions do succeed in some case, but that does not change the millions of people that were affected by it. And so that concludes my arguments. And we firmly stand on our belief that sanctions do more harm than good. And that's all for me. Thank you.
In conclusion, members of the House, let us step back and ask what we are really judging here today. We are not judging economic sanctions by how they are described in press releases or by the good intentions of the governments that impose them. We are judging them by what they actually do in the real world to real people. And when we look honestly at that record, the picture is not a flattering one. Our first argument showed you that the burden of sanctions falls overwhelmingly on those least responsible for the decisions being punished. Political leaders retain their access to resources, their security, and often their wealth. It is the ordinary citizen, the worker who loses their job when a factory can no longer import materials, the mother who cannot find affordable medicine, and the farmer who suddenly cannot afford fertilizer because a war on the other side of the world disrupted global supply chains. Who absorbed the true costs? We saw this ripple all the way to Indonesia, a country with no direct role in the conflicts that triggered these sanctions, and yet whose people still felt the price at the market and the petrol station. The promised outcome rarely follows. Sanctions governments do not simply capitulate, they adapt, they find new trading partners, they tighten control at home. And in many cases, they use the sanction themselves as a rallying cry, proof in their telling of foreign hostility, which only strengthens their grip rather than weakening it. Decades of sanctions on Iran have not delivered political transformation they promised. Sanctions on Russia have not reversed the policy they were designed to stop. The pressure is real, but the outcome remains elusive, uncertain, and in many cases indefinitely delayed. And when the opposition tells you that sanctions are simply the peaceful alternative to war, we ask you to look closer. Peace cannot be measured only by the absence of bombs. A policy that quietly deprives families of food, medicine, and livelihood is not humane simply because no shots were fired. Suffering does not stop being suffering just because it happens slowly, through crises and short ages, rather than through violence. So, members of the House, policies must be judged by their outcomes, not by their intentions. Economic sanctions are designed to pressure governments. In practice, they often devastate ordinary populations from rural Indonesia. While the very governments they target adapt, endure, and sometimes emerge more entrenched than before, when the people who suffer most had no hand in the decisions being punished and the intended political outcome remains uncertain at best, the conclusion is unavoidable. Economic sanctions do more harm than good. For these reasons, I proudly support today's motion. Thank you.